Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the greatest games on the Blizzard. My name is Marcus Speller. With me is Jonathan Wilson. And with us is Herbie Sykes, a Turin-based journalist who specialises in the history of road bicycle racing and an author of a number of books, including the award-winning The Race Against the Stasi and more recently Juve, 100 Years of an Italian Footballing Dynasty. Herbie, pleasure to have you on the pod.
Thanks for having me.
Today we're going back to the 1934 World Cup final in Rome that finished Italy 2, Czechoslovakia 1. Herbie, why have you chosen this game?
I've chosen it for a number of reasons, but I think three specifically. The first is that it was probably the first iteration, if you like, of football as a geopolitical, or sport as a geopolitical construct. The fascists had spent colossal amounts of money on new stadia, and the players, the team, was indivisible from the ideology. So when they wore the blue shirt, they actually represented fascism as well as Italy because they were one and the same thing. So that, I think, was important. We always think of the 1936 Berlin Olympics as one of the big ideological kind of sporting events. Also because we see in it the kind of genesis of Juventus as Italy's team, as distinct to Turin's team. This was the first of the so-called Juve Nazionale, which was a team packed full of Juventus players. Juve had the most money, and they're the best players, as ever does. And thirdly, because there was match fixing and all sorts of nefarious stuff going on with referees. So it's kind of, if you like, set the trajectory for Italian football moving forward to some degree.
Oh, there's a lot packed in there, Jonathan, the 1934 World Cup. And a lot of it is not stuff that's happening on the field.
Yes, I think that's fair to say. I mean, I think what's amazing is when you look back at some of the coverage of it, even in 1934, so the first World Cup had been in 1930. If you're Uruguay and you believe that the Olympics of 24 and 28 have kind of equivalent status, and certainly they are proper global football tournaments. So even if you're being generous with how you sort of count these things, it's the fourth global sporting event, because the 1932 Olympics, in fact there was no football of 32 Olympics, I think it comes back in 36. 32 Olympics was in LA, and it was, for whatever reason, they got rid of it. But I mean, by 36 it's you have the very clear amateur professional divide. So the fourth major global football tournament, and already people are saying, I'm not sure this has got a future. The attitude of the teams. There's some incredibly violent games, and my sort of specialty in this period is the more northern Central European powers, so Austria and Hungary, particularly Czechoslovakia to a lesser extent. And there's this sort of romantic myth about Danubian football that it was very artistic and very technical, and there's great flair. And there's this perception in the Danubian countries that brutal Italians, kicking them out of tournaments, and Italy go on to beat Hungary in the final in 38. But actually, the quarter-final here between Austria and Hungary, there's a brawl, and it's seen as this sort of disgraceful game. They send things off. So there was a violent edge to everybody in this tournament.
Yeah, it was the first World Cup that required qualification, should say. 32 nations rather tried to qualify, 16 going through to straight knockout matches. And I was quite intrigued that if a match ended in a draw after extra time, the replay would be the following day. And often players who played in the original or the first game didn't make that replay for reasons Jonathan sort of stated there. Uruguay boycotted the tournament as only 4 European nations had accepted their invite to 1930 when they hosted the World Cup. But getting back to this tournament, I mean, again, Herbie, going back to the kind of the politics and so on, I mean, it's been accused of being rather overtly used by Benito Mussolini to promote fascism and his politics and so on. I mean, and that is quite clear.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was the first genuine World Cup. I think Uruguay, for all sorts of reasons, hadn't necessarily resonated around the world. I think this did. The Italians built beautiful new stadia. They built beautiful transport infrastructure, because this mattered a lot. They had a lot more riding on this than kind of sporting hearts and flowers.
And was this because Italy was a fairly new nation?
Yeah, it was only unified in 1861, obviously, and it had been, and obviously conflict tends to create fidelity to the flag and those kinds of things. And conflict was indivisible from fascism. In fascism, the individual was kind of fairly incidental, and the ideology glorified conflict, bloodshed. It was very bellicose at the best of times. And so, and they realised very early on, sports minister, a guy named Starace, realised very early on that football, obviously radio existed now as well. And so as a means of disseminating this propaganda, radio was very, very useful. It worked. There was a very famous radio telecronista, a football journalist. So put it all together, and it was the perfect vehicle. It was kind of one for all and all for one. Cycling had been the most popular sport hitherto, but Mussolini and the fascists thought that quite plebeian. And they promoted motorsports because they were cutting edge and dangerous, and the drivers were fearless, and they were promoted as Italian patriots. And of course, football, this strength through ardour, was perfect.
But am I right in saying that even the sort of creation of Serie A is a sort of fascist project to unify?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It was a fascist. Hitherto, there'd been the Lega Nazionale divided between the north and the south. Didn't really work. Serie A was a kind of a reaction against what they call provincialismo, which is Italians tend to be quite provincial, and they were trying to build a country. They were trying to unify, the brigand south with the, relatively speaking, evolved north. So yeah.
And so there's then this ban on foreign players, which comes in late 20s. So is that 2028?
I think it was after that, actually. But yeah, there was a ban on foreign players that weren't of Italian extraction.
Right.
So Hungarians, Czechs, the Austrians, as you mentioned, but not the so-called Oriundi, who would be the Argentines. Obviously, there'd been a huge Italian diaspora. Millions of Italians had made for the Americas, and the Argentinian national side was full of Italian surnames. They were the sons of the diaspora. So the most famous ones would be Orsi and Monti, who both played in this World Cup final, in point of fact. And they were useful constructs in themselves, because in repatriating their talent, they were the proof that fascism was morally, intellectually, culturally superior to the kind of woolly liberalism that was being practiced elsewhere. So yes, they banned foreign players that weren't of Italian extraction.
Jonathan, in the Danubian nations, as you mentioned earlier, the likes of Hungary and so on, had politics sort of entered football in a way that it had in Italy?
It had shaped it, but it hadn't been as sort of directly involved. I think from what Herbie was saying, particularly about radio, that really resonated because of the situation in Argentina, where football is this great unifying force, because Argentina was an immigrant nation. You've got, I think, at the start of the First World War, I think the figures are 1 million people of Spanish descent, 800,000 Italians, 400,000 Northern European Jews, 400,000 Arabs, 40,000 Germans, 30,000 French, 30,000 British and Irish. So it's this great sort of melting pot, and they all do things in very different ways, and they all have very different ideas on how you should build a political system, on culture. And one of the very few things they do all agree on is when Argentina play football, they want Argentina to win. So when Argentina play Uruguay, as completely arbitrary as that divide may be, they want the blue and white stripes to beat the all pale blue shirts. So that's what football becomes, this great sort of tool, and it's very self-conscious in Argentina. But radio was this great thing that even though the vast majority of clubs were based in Buenos Aires, if you were in the jungles in Tucumán in the north, or if you're in the tundra down in Tierra del Fuego on a Sunday afternoon, you were listening to the radio, and listening to commentary and updates from the games. And so, football and tango, because they had live broadcasts from the tango halls, are the two things that really sort of craft or pull Argentina together as a nation. So it sounds as though that is much more similar to the situation in Italy than what was happening in Austria and Hungary. Whereas I think it's almost the opposite is what's happening in Hungary, that it's so turbulent in those years immediately after the First World War that there is this enormous diaspora. So one of the things I find fascinating about Italian football at this period is they ban foreign players, but they absolutely don't ban foreign coaches.
No.
So there was 60 Hungarians coached in Italy between the end of the First World War and the end of the Second World War. 60. And Vittorio Pozzo, who wins the World Cup in 34 and 38, he's really the first. Am I right in saying he's really sort of the first great Italian coach? But there had been the influence of a large number of great Hungarian coaches.
Yeah, I don't think Pozzo was a coach as such. He was very good.
Sorry, that's probably a bad manager. Sorry,
yeah, but no, you're right. He was the godfather of Italian football, if you like, or is perceived as such today. But he wasn't particularly, from a technical point of view, he wasn't particularly highly regarded. But he surrounded himself with people that were. And yeah, you're right. This thing about the likes of Arpan Weiss, those guys that were allowed to continue coaching. I guess I don't think the coach at that time was perceived as a particularly significant figure. I think that probably came along much later with the likes of Herrera, as far as I can deduce. So yeah, but they were kind of technical guys that weren't particularly newsworthy in their own right, I think.
Yeah, I mean Weiss I think writes the first coaching manual in Italian.
Yeah.
Which I think comes out in 26 or 27, and Pozzo ends up writing the foreword to later editions of that.
Yeah.
Or maybe even the first edition, because Pozzo had been the technical director of the national team from first time in 24.
Yeah, much earlier. Yeah.
So yeah, it's probably the first edition that Pozzo writes the foreword to.
But even before they banned the foreigners, you were finding they banned the use of English terms. So corner, goal, offside, football became il gioco di calcio because they needed to create a fascist stroke Italian identity. And a lot of those Central European players Italianized their names because the environment generally was very hostile towards foreigners at that time.
I mean, as far as I see it, Herbie, with Pozzo, he seems to be, as you say, this manager. He seems to kind of be. He's an intriguing guy. Managed to sort of bring it all together. This idea of unifying a nation and trying to get everybody else. He seemed to be quite good at that, from what I can gather. And he pioneered. He was quite interesting. So he used pre-tournament training camps, for example, which not many others did as well. So is he seen as you say he was the godfather of Italian football and whatnot, but a very crucial man in this side, and being almost, I know Brian Glanville's talked about his thoughts on Pozzo's true political motivations and so on, but was he almost politician-like, if you see what I mean, in the dugout leading this side?
Yeah, of course, possibly he had a journalistic background, so he was quite an urbane individual at a time when Italy probably only had 50% literacy. So yeah, he seems to have been. I don't know how best to describe it, but
he knew how to work the system. Maybe
there wasn't a great deal that he couldn't do, and there wasn't anybody that he didn't know. And obviously, prior to the Agnelli's incursion in 23, it had been an amateur sport. It had been an amateur sport, and so at a time of significant growth, he was this kind of avuncular figure, very intelligent, politically quite skilled, who seems, as you say, to have been able to kind of knit this nascent sport together in some way. Yeah.
I mean, I think his background is fascinating. The fact that he comes from a family that worked in textiles. his family had clearly set him out to be a textile manager, and he ends up studying commerce in Zurich and then in London, and then goes to Bradford to study textile factories more closely, and starts watching football or carries on watching football. And he ends up.
Yeah, well, that's Italian football in microcosm, of course, because they were in Bradford and Nottingham, and
Yeah, and he goes to watch Manchester United and absolutely loves their famous halfback line, the Duck Rebel halfback line of Duckworth, Roberts, and Bell, and becomes good friends with Charlie Roberts.
All right, chaps, let's go for a quick break, and then we'll talk about Pozzo and the 1934 World Cup final a bit more. See you in a moment, everybody. Welcome back to the Greatest Games on the Blizzard. Jonathan, Vittorio Pozzo, we need to mention the Matodo system, which did he pioneer, popularise? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the sort of very romantic version of it is that because he was good friends with Charlie Roberts, who was a great centre-half of the old school, that when English football moves from the 2-3-5 to the WM in 1925, he sort of thinks that's too negative and too defensive and turns against it. And this is what he calls sistema, and he prefers Matodo, where the centre-half is he would still pick up the opposing centre-forward, but he also had attacking responsibilities. So I think if you look at Monti, who he brings in, both at Juve and then for Italy, then Monti was sort of this famous... He's sort of the first in that great line of Argentinian Cincos, number 5s, who sits at the back of midfield. He was a thug, let's be honest. But he was a thug who was very good at football. And he was sort of this sort of figure of terror in Argentinian football. People were genuinely scared of him. And
he's a very quiet man off the pitch.
Right. And
very shy.
But then the Pancho Barracho, who was the last surviving player from Argentina side from the 1930 World Cup final, the story he always told, and I guess it's convenient to be able to tell this when everybody else is dead and nobody's going to contradict you, is that the moment he knew they weren't going to win that game was when he looked at Monti before kickoff, and Monti, he said, was just white and terrified because he'd got death threats from Uruguayan fans. And he said he thought then, if Monti's scared, we're in big trouble here. And Monti doesn't have a good game in the 1930 World Cup final, but he then moves to Juve the following year, and he becomes integral to Pozzo's Juve and then to Pozzo's Italy at a time when playing for more than one country was very much the done thing.
Yeah.
And we've mentioned Juventus a few times already, Herbie, but they're utterly crucial to this side. 9 of the 22 in Italy scored were Juventus players. 5 of the starting 11 were as well. So for a team that's sort of trying to unify the nation, their core was very much in Turin with those Juventus players. Yeah,
it was, because they transformed football into a marketplace. I mean, that was right from the get-go. Juventus were a side of kind of a very bourgeois local football team. At the point at which Eduardo Agnelli becomes president, football is an amateur sport, and the players live in their comune. They work in their comune by definition. There are no salaries involved. They're probably rewarded in some way, but yeah, I mean that was the big Juventus project. It was, and largely remains, the Juventus factory team. And the first big scandal of Italian football, the Rosetta affair, where they acquired Rosetta from Provercelli. It was always rooted in money. And so, yeah, at that point, they'd won by the time the 1934 World Cup came along, they'd won 4 championships in succession. They were extremely powerful and they were extremely moneyed. But the thing with Juventus, and I think it's important for non-Italians to understand, is that it had to be seen to be ecumenical. That's to say, not to represent this city, but to represent all of the Italians and all of the disparate Italies, if you like. So yeah, that was always the project, because they needed to sell cars in Florence and in Calabria and in Puglia and the length and breadth of the peninsula, and Juventus was an instrument in that.
One of the non-Juventus players in the side was the great Giuseppe Meazza, Was he at this point? Was he the kind of the superstar that he is of Italian football now? Obviously, the stadium named after him and so on.
Yeah, I think he was. I think Jonathan would probably know as much about this as I do. But yeah, he was the kind of poster boy, I think. He, the keeper, Combi, the rubber man, was a big star. Monti obviously was a superstar, double wardrobes, and Orsi was a kind of a prototype Lionel Messi, you could say. But Schiavio, the front two, Schiavio and Miazza were big stars.
Yeah, well, let's talk about some of the football that was played at that tournament.
Well, we should just say on the subject of Combi, Combi had been this great star, but he was right at the end of his career.
Yeah.
And he was only playing because Giovinezza had damaged his arm just before the tournament. So it was although he was captain, and I think this remains the only World Cup final where both teams are captained by goalkeepers. Although he was the captain, he probably shouldn't have been in the 11.
Yeah, which of course adds to the whole mythology around Combi.
Yeah, it's just one last job. It's
exactly. Yeah, and he'd been one of the three accountants with Rosetta and Caligaris, and they were all at the fag end of their careers. And Pozzo very famously left Caligaris and Rosetta out of the starting lineup. Seemingly, before the semi-final, there is a version of events that says that Mussolini insisted that Eraldo Monzelio, who played for his Bologna, played the semi-final instead of Rosetta from non-fascist Turin. But yeah, I mean, Combi is those three guys, but Combi specifically is part of the kind of the mythology of Juventus and Italian football.
Yeah, I thought someone was going to say, of course, the conditions in the final were very hot and Combi was boiling or something like that. But
very good.
That's very kind of you to leave that for me. But back in the tournament itself, I mean, again, going back to this idea of the sort of the violence that was on the field and so on. In the quarterfinal against Spain, the refereeing came under a bit of scrutiny there, with a number of injuries to players and whatnot. And it was into the semi-final with the game against Austria, where allegations that Mussolini met with several officials before that match, and of course in the final itself. But Jonathan, that semi-final against Austria is particularly suspect.
Well, I mean, I think the quarterfinal bears talking about as well. That they draw 1-1 with Spain, and Zamora is the goalkeeper. The other great Spanish goalkeeper, so badly injured he can't play in the replay. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, goalkeepers weren't as protected then as they are now, but there does seem to have been a pretty clear plan that if you get near Zamora, clatter him, and eventually it works. I mean, it brought the goal as well, but it also means he doesn't play in the replay, which Italy win 1-0.
Yeah, 7 Spaniards, I think. They changed 7 players for the following day. I mean, football was quite robust at the time, very obviously, and it was quite a big ask. But yeah, I think the ref, was the Swiss. The ref was Swiss, and he never refereed again, did he?
Right, I don't know that, but
yeah, he was effectively de-robed the following day, and there was a big stink about it in the French press in particular. It was fairly thuggish.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
yeah,
I think the implication is that he was bought, but there is substantive evidence to that effect.
I mean, where the sort of the evidence begins to mount up, because I think you often get allegations about host nations. I think that's just something that runs through all of football history. So Uruguay, the Argentinians in 1930 would say, the Uruguayans, they had all these benefits, that the crowd intimidated people and whatever. Even England in 1966 had that. Argentina in 1978, South Korea in 2002. That's a trope that runs all the way through. And maybe some cases have more truth than others. But I'm sort of inclined to sympathy, just because it is such a common accusation. Where I think there are really big worries about Italy is in 1938, when it's played in France. And look at the Brazil team that they beat in the semi-final and ask what on earth led Brazil to drop 5 of their best players. And then look at the Hungary team in the final and I've forgotten his name. I can't remember his surname, but the big Hungarian centre-forward is suddenly left out for no reason. And you see the Hungarian press the next day can't quite work it out. And they're sort of saying, well, yeah, has our coach just sort of decided that he wants to make it about him and he's going to overcomplicate things? And there's just this bewilderment as to what's happened, as to why on earth Hungary have picked that team. So of course, I don't know, I can't work out why Brazil would have seen it politically useful to butter up Italy in '38, but certainly for Hungary, which was in this very difficult position between the forces of fascism and communism, yeah, trying to get allies was a huge political necessity at the time. So certainly in Hungary now, I think people look back at that '38 final and ask a lot of questions.
But the semi-final, though, with Austria, Herbie, in this tournament in '34, there's a lot of question marks over this.
Yeah, because Austria had walloped Italy some months previously, 4-1, I think, or 4-2. They'd actually finished Caligari's career. They'd been destroyed by that. And of course, Austria was the Holy Grail. Austria and Hungary were the Holy Grail. The Italians had never. They were the great force in world football. So, yeah, I mean, objectively, it's. But the thing with the Spanish game in particular is there's fairly compelling evidence, but gerrymandering and in Italian football generally, and still today, I think Italians are so deluded as to think that football is just 11 against 11. There's a lot of stuff that informs that, and I think there is a consensus even now in Italy that the Italians won the 1934 World Cup in some way. But I don't think it's perceived with any. What they didn't achieve was any sporting glory, if you like. I think there is a commonly held belief that yes, they won the World Cup and it was necessary so to do, and they whatever cost it needed to be won. And so yeah, it's not something that it exists. They won the thing, but I don't think there's any particular pride in fact.
I mean, this Austria team, unfortunately, I think it's slightly past the Wunder team's peak. I think if you look at the Wunder team, they were absolutely their best, probably around about 32. What they did have was Pepe Bichan, who may or may not be the leading scorer of all time, depending whose statistics you want to believe. But Bichan was this sort of he's tall, he was quick, he was a great finisher, and he had this great partnership with Matthias Sindelar, the paper man, the Papierena, who we talked about a lot when we did the podcast with Kat Peterson. And they had a great forward line. Their goalkeeper wasn't there. Rudi Heeden had gone, and he was the real great keeper. So it's just a shame the way for Austria, the way the World Cups fell, that they weren't there in 30, and by the time it got to 34, they weren't quite at the height they'd been in 32. And what ends up happening is that Sindelar, who was this sort of deep-lying centre forward, and Bichan would play inside right and run beyond him, that Monti picks up Sindelar and does a job on him.
What about the Czechs, Jonathan? Obviously beaten finalists. I mean, they'd beaten Romania, Switzerland and Germany on the way. Were they seen as one of the top sides in Europe? Yeah,
I think so. I mean, they're very much part of that Danubian tradition. Maybe not quite at the level of Hungary and Austria, but definitely a good side. Niedli, the inside forward, was sort of their Sindelar equivalent, this sort of slight creator. And again, Monti picked him up and did a job on him. The goalkeeper, Planichka, is, I think, one of the great European goalkeepers of all time. So yeah, they were absolutely seen as a great side and
overwhelming favourites for the final, certainly.
Yeah.
Well, and so the allegations that, as I mentioned earlier, Mussolini meeting with several officials beforehand and so on and so forth. Is there much? How is the young Swedish referee Ivan Erkling? Where does he fit into all this? He's the youngest referee still, I believe, to officiate a final at the age of 29. Herbie, interesting.
I don't. I mean,
off fact rather.
Yeah, it's not. Where say the Swiss guy is infamous, and obviously his career ended after the Spain game. I don't know much actually about the I don't think there's any direct implication or inference that the Swedish that the guy was bought in the final. It's clear that the Italians kicked them off the park, but I'm not entirely sure that there's any kind of suggestion that he was corrupted per se. Though I wouldn't be in the least surprised, but I don't think it's ever kind of.
Sure.
It's not in the public domain.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say they're going into the game that Czechoslovakia were the overwhelming favourites. Is that how they saw it in Italy? Were they concerned or were they quietly confident? Perhaps?
No, I think the Czechs objectively were a better side, but they, as you said, Jonathan, they were new to the first half. By all accounts, was fairly sterile. There is a kind of a perception that the Italians were paralysed by fear and sort of at the point at which the Czechs took the lead with 20 minutes left, they gave it a go.
It was a very hot day as well, wasn't it?
Yes.
That seems to be mentioned in a lot of reports, so whether that held people back a bit.
Conceivably, yeah. But I think the point of all of this is it's fairly nebulous, and I think that kind of and that's attached itself to the Azzurri and to Italian football, subsequent too. It's nobody really knows what happened. But,
well, I mean, that's an interesting point in itself, that the footage that's available from this game is nowhere near as good as the footage from the previous final. The 1930 final, I wouldn't say there's lengthy highlights, but there's a good sort of 6 or 7 minutes. And they've been sort of, I don't know what you do to them, but they've been enhanced somehow, and they put a kind of colour filter over. And it you can watch it and you can understand what's going on in the game. Whereas this, you get some images, you see balls flashing at the nets, you see a lot of Italians kicking Czechs. And apart from that, it's pretty hard to work out what's going on.
Yeah, I was going to be cruel to Jonathan and say, well, why don't you talk us through the
There's an interesting thing happened in Milan that afternoon as well, because it was the final stage of the Giro d'Italia. Talk about cycling, which is my thing. But Learco Guerra, who was the most famous cyclist in Italy, was a card-carrying fascist. And almost simultaneously, at the point at which the winner was scored in Rome, Guerra clinched the Giro d'Italia, having tried for many, many years and failed. So you got this, and that obviously equally kind of rubber stamped fascism's sporting superiority, if you will. So one way, and obviously the footballers, the racing drivers, all of the sportivi were kind of perceived as great fascist ideologues, and so it was. So whilst they were winning in Rome, they were also winning the Giro, which was, and at that point cycling was still just about the most popular sport, although football was catching up. So one way or another, it worked out really well for the regime.
Yeah.
So that's like that moment when Leicester sealed the Premier League just as Mark Selby's winning the World Snooker title.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, kind of.
Obviously, you mentioned, Italy, they scored the winning goal. It was in extra
well,
time.
we can talk through the goals from reading the match report.
Well,
so,
if you think you can do it, then fire away.
Well, we know that, this is disputed even, whether it's a 71st or a 76th minute, but on the 70-something minute, Antonin Puch, the Czech right winger, he's just been clattered by Ferraris. He's been off the pitch. Pozzo actually comes on the pitch to help carry him off. And they wave some ammonia or something under his nose. He goes back on, and on this sort of drug-induced high, he sort of he takes Niedli's pass, goes past Monzelio, and sort of slices a shot in at the near post. So that's maybe 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes to go, and the Czechs lead. And then 9 minutes to go, Orsi, the played for Argentina in the 28 Olympic final. And it's actually a really nice run from him, from what you can make out. That he goes past one defender, and it appears that he shapes to shoot left-footed, and then actually hits it with the outside of his right foot. And it then just sort of floats over Planička. And I think in the Czech press there's some discussion as to whether Planička should have done better. But Planička was only 5'8", so I kind of think
he could just deny it, couldn't he?
Well, people generally were a lot shorter, of course. Combi would have been about 5'7-ish, 5'8-ish.
Yeah, but I mean, the footage does show the ball going just under the bar. So I guess if you're 5'8", that is quite hard to get. So the game goes into extra time and 5 minutes into extra time. And actually, where Pozzo does do something tactical is he switches over Schiavio and Goita, which seems to cause chaos for the Czechs. And if you again, footage is quite hard to make out, but the Czech centre half Chambal seems to be missing. I don't, who knows where, but he's not in the position to expect the centre half to be. And
Pozzo's carried him off the field, maybe. That's the tactics.
And Miazza plays a 3-ball to Goita, goes in the box and plays it to Schiavio, who scores. So there's some suggestion Miazza might have handled the ball in the build-up, but I'm really not in a position to judge that from here.
We'll never know, will we? And then they win the World Cup. I mean, it is interesting when you talk about this Italian side and obviously the allegations of match fixing and so on and so forth, and bribes and whatnot. I mean, they won this tournament. They did win the 1935 Central European International Cup, which was a big tournament at the time. You've mentioned they won the 36 Olympics, and they went on to win the 38 World Cup in France, admittedly in dubious circumstances.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt they're a really good side. It's whether they're a really good side plus. I think it's the extent of that plus. They weren't jokers by any means. They were a really, really good football team.
Yeah, but this period, this sort of 1930s period of Italian football, Herbie, you say, is obviously very important. It's this kind of the makings of Italy. How is it viewed now in its sort of entirety? Is it seen as a sort of a dominant period, or people sort of slightly, for want of a better word, embarrassed because of the politics surrounding it?
No, I think it's the beginning of football's kind of ascent to the top of the sporting paradigm, and it's associated with that. And that process, if you like, was speeded up by television. So these are two pivotal moments. I think the period 34 to 38 was instrumental in kind of cementing it as the national sport. It was ever thus. Think about Boris Becker and Steffi Graf made tennis extremely popular in Germany in the same way that Wiggins and Cavendish did cycling. And it was, it's just the way it is with sport, isn't it? It's the champions that create this kind of groundswell. So I think it was very important in that respect. The 5 years of, my book is about Juventus, obviously, and the 5 years of 5 consecutive championships for Juventus were very important in this idea of Juventus being Italy's team, the Juve Nazionale. So it was the beginning, if you like, of football as a mainstream or as the mainstream sport. 50,000 people in a stadium. That had never happened before.
Mm-hmm. And what is I suppose, Jonathan, what is the kind of overall sort of influence and sort of legacy Pozzo's had in terms of his coaching methods and all that in the wider, more international game?
Well, I think Herbie's right that I think he was not a tactical innovator in any sense. Mm-hmm. I think he understood football, but I think if you look at the sort of really clever pioneering coaches of the 30s and 40s, they tend to be Hungarian and Austrian. So you look at what Weiss did, for instance. Weiss was clearly a genius, or Bukovi just after the war. And I think Pozzo's a little bit like Sebesh in Hungary from 49 through to 56, that he was a great sort of... he was a manager rather than a coach. He was very good at understanding how the system worked. He appointed the right people. So I don't think he's got a great coaching legacy. I think his legacy... Herbie will know more about this than I do, but his legacy in Italy is sort of disputed. That there were suggestions in 1990 that the Delle Alpi should be named after him, but because he was perceived as having had links to fascism, that was vetoed. But then he's sort of been exonerated because it was found that he'd helped partisans towards the end of the war. That all seems very complicated and not particularly convincing to me. But
it's all very complicated. You couldn't not be a fascist. The reality is, if you wanted to get ahead in any form of life, it was implicit that you'd be a fascist. And so we kind of view that stuff through a 21st century prism, or you talk about the Italian 90 thing. Very obviously he was a fascist. Couldn't not be. Couldn't do his job if he weren't. You subscribed. and if he didn't, I mean, Alemanni would be another one that he was. The big scandal around Alemanni, and they always say that he was a scapegoat because he was the one famous Italian player that wasn't in the party. So yeah, but I think probably the first great Italian coach would be Carcano. And there's all sorts of kind of stuff around him and his.
Well, I mean, the suggestion is that he was sacked for being gay.
Because homosexuality didn't actually exist under fascism in the same way that prostitution didn't exist. There were rumours that he was sodomizing in the fascist vernacular the Juventus players. But yes, he was ushered out in 1930, that December actually, shortly after the World Cup win, and kind of lived out the rest of his days somewhere on the Ligurian coast. So yeah, he left in disgrace because Juve needed to project a certain set of values, and the players needed to be perceived as Italian patriots, rigor, and so yeah, it was. But there were a lot of rumours in and around Turin that he was homosexual.
I mean, this is something that fascinates me. And I don't quite understand that. Clearly, an integral part of fascism is this focus on militarism and muscularity and rigour, to use the word you just used. And clearly, these two, Italy that won the World Cup in 34 and 38, had this rigour, this physical toughness. And then you read Gianni Brera writing, after the Second World War, and his argument is always, Italians are a weak race, we're a small race, that's why we always get invaded, and so we need to be cleverer, we need to be more cunning, we need to be more cynical than the rest, and that's how he sort of justifies defensive football. So how do those two things marry up? The rigour of a team of the 30s and Brera's belief in some kind of Italian physical inferiority?
Well, I think it's true to say that whatever they were doing in the 30s was effective. So the cynicism, or the gamesmanship, or call it what you will, the stuff that worked. Broadly speaking, it worked. They won 2 World Cups and they won the Olympics. And so I think in general, Italian sport doesn't subscribe to some kind of dim-witted Corinthian value system. It would be very nice. It would be very nice if it did, but actually, it's about winning, and sport is not indivisible from the life quotidian here. To get on in this country, at times living in this country feels like a chess match between the individual and the state in this country, and you've to do what the Italians would call scaltro, which is a bit savvy. So if the Italians have a reputation for being quite clever, and the reputation the Italians do have, it's because to get along here you need to be able to circumvent bureaucracy, and that obviously is reflected in the way they do sports, and specifically in the way they do football. There's which plays back into the whole idea of Juventus being particularly good at cheating, and by and large, 50% of the Italian population is convinced that they're just really, really good at it. and that in turn plays into the whole dialogue, the whole thing about the referees, because it can't not be like that, because this is Italy.
Yeah. I feel that's a good place to stop, Herbie. For all of our sakes. But it's been really fascinating talking to you and hearing all your thoughts on the 1934 World Cup final, and so much more, of course. So thank you very much for coming on the pod.
Thank you very much.
For more stories like that, do check out theblizzard.co.uk. But once again, thank you to Herbie. Cheerio from Jonathan and myself. We'll be back next week with another great game from the history of football. See you then.